Welcome to the 75th Forest Industry Lecture Series. The first lecture was given by C. Ross Silversides in November 1977. That's pretty long time ago. And the title of his lecture was Industrial Forestry in Changing World. And right now we have Dr. Martell from University of Toronto is talking about emerging challenges and opportunities in the Boreal forest region of Canada. I think it's very apparent from the title that it's Canada, and then the dealing with the Canadian forest is always the focus of this Forest Industrial Lecture Series. This lecture has brought many forest practitioners, academics and governments, and then industry together over the years, and really provided a great platform to discuss emerging issues in the forestry affecting Canadian forest. The lecture is possible due to generous contributions from our number of sponsors. Now I would like to take a moment and I would like to acknowledge these sponsors in alphabetic order. You can see the slides. First we have Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, Alberta Forest Products Associations, Alberta Innovates Biosolutions, Alberta Newsprint Company, Alberta Pacific Forest Industries, Altus Geomatics, CAM4, CIF Rocky Mountain Section, College of Alberta Professional Foresters, College of Professional Forest Technologists, Con E. Dermott Environment and Forestry Services, DLL Piper Canada LLP, Earth Econ Inc., FRI Research, FORCOP Solutions, Forest Soil Science Limited, FB Innovations Foreign Tech, F5 Forest Limited, Green Link Forestry Inc., Horseshoe Creek Consulting H2C Limited, Incremental Forest Technologies Limited, Miller Western Forest Products Limited, MNP LLP, Nature Resources Canada, Division of Canadian Forest Service, Northern Forestry Center, Nicol Environmental Solutions Inc., Norbord Inc., Philip Robert Enterprises Limited, PVC Canada, Silvercom Limited, Tolco Industries Limited, Wonderwell Contractors 1971 Limited, West Fraser Mills Limited, Weyerhaeuser Company Limited, and Woodland Operations Learning Foundations called WOLF. Now I would like to give a big round of applause for our sponsors. And this lecture was sponsored by 34 organizations so far. Now I would like to invite the Dean of Faculty of ALS to welcome you.
Thank you, Nadir, and thank you to all of you for coming to witness this, our 75th Forest Industry Lecture. So I realize this does not go by years, but I would think about this as our diamond lecture of the Phils. Again, not necessarily by anniversary, but this could be the semi-sesquicentennial lecture, the Dodran Centennial Lecture, but it's good to have you here for this 75th event. We very much appreciate it, and we're very grateful that Dr. David Martell accepted our invitation, and I'm very much looking forward to his talk. I'd just like to take a moment. As you know, we lost a former premier of this province, Premier Don Getty, and as you would have seen from the AFPA statement and a number of others from our forest industry colleagues, there was a great deal of respect for what Premier Getty did for the work of the forest industry during a time of great change when he was the Premier of the province. And as a faculty, we would certainly like to acknowledge his passing and note our respect to his family and the colleagues that he did work with. As you know, our faculty is launching into its second century. And I would say that there are amazing things that are going on. We're very proud of the work that's going on at the undergraduate level within our faculty. We have a Rhodes Scholar identified this year from our faculty. Within the forestry programs, we see a strong uptick in registration, which we are very confident will continue on. And I know after attending the banquet of our graduates from last year, the jobs that they are getting. So thank you to the people in the audience that are supporting our graduates at the undergrad level. If you spend any time out in the foyer, you would have seen the great work of our graduate students that are supporting work across this sector in very strong ways. And we think about the research side of things. We recently had the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry here visiting our faculty, and it was great to have Minister Carlier visit in John Spence's lab to meet his graduate students, to understand about the kinds of things that are going on, not only in EMEND, although we talked about that, but a number of the other initiatives that are supporting our forest industry in this province and beyond. Just a couple of weeks ago, we actually looked at the evaluation of all of our faculty members. I love that time. It gives me a chance to get a snapshot of everything that's going on. And what we expect of our professors is that they're involved in teaching, which I've talked about, involved in research, but also in that community service aspect. And I see many of our people that are very engaged with the organizations that you support, that are supportive of the forestry industry across the province. So it's a nice fit. And really that leads me back in a circle to thanking you for supporting the people that we produce, those high-quality graduates, for supporting the research that we do, and as you heard from Nadir, even just the tremendous support for this lecture series. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased that you were able to come. I'm sure that you're going to enjoy the lecture. Thanks again.
Now I would like to invite Jan Beverly to introduce our speaker.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Jen Beverly with the Department of Renewable Resources, and it's my distinct honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. David Martell, who will be addressing the important topic of challenges and opportunities in the Boreal Forest region of Canada. Now, the Boreal Forest is a complex socio-ecological system known for its awesome crown fires, and it's also dotted with northern communities that support a range of industrial activities. One of those communities is Kirkland Lake in northeastern Ontario. Now, the Kirkland Lake area is known for producing a number of things, including gold, NHL hockey players, and arguably the most influential fire management researcher in Canada. From his beginnings in Kirkland Lake, our speaker went on to the University of Toronto, where he completed undergraduate, master's, and a PhD degree in applied sciences in the Department of Industrial Engineering. Today, he is a professor in the Faculty of Forestry at the University of Toronto, where he began his academic career 40 years ago. And during this time, he has applied his expertise in operational research to the complex problems faced by fire and forest managers. And during that time, he has amassed an impressive legacy of research contributions. He is the associate editor of several journals. He is a past member of Ontario's Provincial Forest Policy Committee, and he is the recipient of distinguished awards in the operational research community. Beyond his impressive scholarly contributions, he is also a remarkable and incredible teacher and mentor. And as one of his many students who are in the room, former students who are in the room today, I can say that my own personal experiences were shaped and inspired by his thoughtful approach to research and his practice of working closely with managers and practitioners. Throughout his career, he has sought out opportunities to embed himself within the organizations that he studied and to observe their decision-making challenges firsthand. He started doing that as a summer student, and after finishing his PhD as a fire crew member. And even today, he participates as a member of incident command teams that are dispatched to large fires. We're very fortunate to have him here to share this unique perspective, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr. David Martell.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure. The Dean said it was nice that I would come here, and I didn't think about it. I just accepted the invitation for obvious reasons. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is, most of you think of this as a great university, and it is, but I also think of it as in many respects, ground zero in terms of fire research in Canada. Through the efforts of a number of people in the Alberta government, among them Bruce Mayer, and other people in the university, felt it was a good time to make a special initiative towards creating the Western Partnership for Wildland and Fire Science, which is led by Mike Flanagan and has a large number of students, and Jennifer as well. So it's kind of like this is where there is probably more fire research going on here than any place else in Canada. So it didn't take me very long to accept the invitation. When I looked at the list of speakers that have been here before, Nadir mentioned Ross Silversides, who I had the pleasure of knowing in my very early years, and Des Crosley, who was revered in the forest community. So it's an exceptional pleasure to be invited to come and participate in a lecture series that they started, so to speak. The other thing is I have been in contact with some of my former students. I had them not put the lights too dim because I want to see some of them, but I expect most of them are in the back row because that's where they often were. And I heard a speaker once say, well, it's nice to come to university, you get to chat with students. And I did go out and I didn't have much time, but I chatted with some of the posters. But when I heard that person say that, it's nice to be invited to come to a university and chat with students, but he doesn't get the full of it. It's an incredible privilege and a pleasure to actually get to work in one and work with students all the time. And my wife is a sociologist, and one of the differences between teaching in the arts and sciences and teaching in a professional faculty is every once in a while you're out wandering around the woods and you run into a former student. And that is one of the most pleasurable aspects of being a professor. So the fact that I knew some of you would be in the room today made it a special pleasure. So I'm going to talk to you about the Boreal forest, and I'm going to warn you, and most of you probably know, I'm going to try to keep it broad, but I'm going to be giving you a picture of the Boreal forest through what can best be described as smoky glasses. And that picture kind of just reminds us that I am primarily interested in fire. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination that fire is the most important thing, but it's the most important thing to me. So when I'm talking about the Boreal forest and its management, I'm going to be giving you a talk from the perspective of somebody who's primarily interested in fire. So what I'm going to do this afternoon, sort of give you a quick overview, I'm going to fly over the Boreal forest from a 500-meter perspective. If you wonder why that 500 meters, that's where detection aircraft usually fly, and that's what I've been doing most of my research on lately. I'm going to talk about some of the drivers that are shaping the Boreal forest and its management. And I'm going to talk about some challenges and opportunities. And a note about challenges and opportunities, originally I was going to talk about challenges, and I called up one of the managers that I work with and said, tell me, what kind of challenges should I be thinking about? And he said, well, here's some of the challenges. But he said, challenges aren't bad all the time. He said, I like challenges. They give me problems to solve, and I enjoy solving problems. So when I say challenges, I don't necessarily mean negative things. However, you will see there are some challenges that there aren't a lot of opportunities that really are evil. But I have a mix of some of them that I'm going to talk about. Then I'm going to make, when you come to a talk like this, people expect you to say something profound. I don't think I'm going to say anything profound, but I'm going to close off with a couple of comments. Think of them as take-home messages. So this, of course, is the Boreal forest. The slide's a little faded. Normally that's a little darker green, but the Boreal forest is a circumpolar forest. We have a large part of it in Canada, and in fact, it's the largest forest region in Canada. And this is the standard sort of Rose Forest Regions of Canada map of the forest regions. and the dark green is where I am primarily interested in. So, sort of secondary, where am I going to go for the next few minutes on my 500-meter flight across the Boreal Forest? First, I guess I want to talk about why I'm interested in the Boreal Forest. I just got this spring, I went with a group of students to Costa Rica. A lot of people in my faculty think, you know, tropical forests are the greatest thing in the world, and I can obviously see their importance and their interest in them, but I still prefer the Boreal Forest. So I'm going to give you a few reasons why I pay particular attention and like the Boreal Forest. Then I'm going to talk about some of the values that are associated with it or flow from the Boreal Forest. And then I'm going to talk about some natural and some anthropogenic disturbances that shape the Boreal Forest. And from my perspective, it complicates its management. So one of the reasons that I'm interested in the Boreal Forest is that's where I was born. And to the extent that it happened, that's where I grew up. So Jennifer mentioned that I was born in Kirkland Lake, which is around here. And Kirkland Lake has produced a lot of hockey players. I'm certainly not one of those, not by any stretch of the imagination. Dave Shane's probably in the audience. I think I just heard him chuckle. I used to play hockey with Dave. I still try to play hockey, but I always say, well, I try. They take my money and they let me out on the ice. After I lived there for a while, I moved to northern Quebec, a place called Gagnon. My family grew up in the mining industry, so we were at an iron ore property in northern Quebec. And then later we moved down to Sept-Îles, which was a harbor, a port, iron ore port, which is sort of on the southern edge of the Boreal Forest. And somebody once asked me, well, were you interested in fire because you were up there? And the answer was no. The fire was all around us. When I was young, one of my uncles had his cottage burned before I was born, and I was told that. Well, that's interesting. And an area north of my town was the site of north of Kirkland Lake was the Matheson fire, which was particularly destructive. And when I moved to Blind River, that was close to the so-called Chapel of Mississauga fire. When I moved to Gagnon, the year before I moved there, the town was evacuated. When I went there, it was surrounded by a fire break and a big black area. But never in my mind did I ever think that I would go become working in fire. But one day, I went out there, and that's me on the right, up in Gagnon. The town was surrounded by smoke and fire, and they brought in these air tankers, so we did what everybody else did, went out and looked at the air tankers. So I always like to think of this, a lot of my research is done on air tanker management. This is where I got introduced to the air tanker management problem. So, I've been to Costa Rica, I've been to Brazil. They're beautiful forests, but I think the Boreal Forest is beautiful as well. So I'm not a good photographer. One of my colleagues, Justina Ray, took these pictures of the Boreal Forest. And one of them you can see has got a nice disturbance path in them. So the Boreal Forest is a source of a lot of social values. There are a lot of First Nations communities in the Boreal Forest, particularly in northwestern Ontario. So to them, that's their home. That's important for cultural preservation. And there's a lot of recreation opportunities. The picture up on the right is one of my favorite campsites where I go with my family. There's a lot of important ecological values. When I started when I started in the forestry community, the ecological values were not called ecological values. There were forest ecologists, and there were, forest managers, but there wasn't a lot of interest in the so-called ecological values that there is today. But the picture on the bottom left is a wolverine, which is an endangered species in northwestern Ontario, and the two on the right are caribou. And caribou are a charismatic species. They're also a significant challenge to the forest industry, and they're sort of the hot button item in much of the Boreal Forest these days. Those of you in the forest industry will certainly appreciate that. But I've always known that the forest is a source of water. I never really understood it till I came out to Alberta and spent some time with Barry. And he showed me all the hydrological stuff that he was doing, Barry White. and all the hydrological stuff he was doing and all the neat models he was developing with other colleagues. And it's like, wow, this is interesting. I never knew anything about this. And there's economic values. And the primary economic values in most of the boreal forest, at least the part where I am, is the source of fibers for the forest industry. On the left is a clear cut that many people like to hate. On the right is a selection cut. But we should never forget that, you know, there are a lot of interesting values in the forest, but there are communities up there. And if we don't look after our forest-dependent communities in the far north, and one of the ways is doing it with a strong forest industry, then everybody has to move to Toronto, and that's not a good thing. So, the boreal forest is very much a natural disturbance forest, and that's why both fire people and ecologists are interested. So there's lots of insects, disease, storms, and fire. And there's a photograph of what's called the Back Lake Blowdown, which I took in 2005 in northwestern Ontario, 30,000 hectares of blowdown. The fire people have been trying to burn it out in patches to reduce the flammability of the landscape, but you can see it's a challenge, and they're working at it. There's also interesting interactions, particularly between insects and disease. And anybody that's, we haven't had recent spruce budworm problems in Ontario, but anybody has been in BC Interior for the last while, and anybody in Alberta who fears the mountain pine beetle knows what I'm talking about. There's basically red, dead trees as far as the eye can go, and some of the most contentious, intense, flammable fires occurring in the BC Interior. The boreal forest is also shaped by anthropogenic disturbances, lots of railway construction and operation, and railways cause fires as well. Timber harvesting fragments the landscape, road construction and use. One of my wildlife colleagues says, I'm not too worried about the harvesting, I'm worried about the roads. Oil and gas exploration, and depending on harvest patterns. One of my students once described, I guess this is a common description, described the kind of picture on the right. He calls them moose motels, and you can see them in Google. So there's a lot of disturbances going on out there. So I want to talk about some of the drivers that are influencing the boreal forest. And you can't talk about the boreal forest, and you can't talk about fire, and you can't come to the University of Alberta with Mike Flanagan and not talk about climate change. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is climate change, but nowhere near as comprehensively as Mike could. Then I'm going to talk about changing land use patterns as one of the drivers that's influencing the forest, changing public attitudes, and fiscal realities. So, one of the reasons I'm interested in the boreal forest is fires. Many of you in the forest sector went into forestry because you wanted to work in the forest. I didn't do that. As Jennifer said, I was educated as an industrial engineer. I had a summer job working in the fire control unit, for those of you who are interested in the fire, the old terminology. And my job is to write computer programs. And I went on and did a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD. And when it was ending, the Faculty of Forestry at the University of Toronto advertised a job in fire. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I should apply for that. They'll actually pay me to do that. So I applied for it. So basically, I got into forestry because I was drawn to fire and because I wanted to live in Toronto, which is kind of the mirror image of most of you. I understand that. As I said, I'm going to talk about the forest through smoky glasses. So I want to talk a little bit about, you know, my perception from where I sit in the larger landscape. And I want to talk about fire management, the fire management research community. When people meet me, particularly in the city, they say, they have two questions. Oh, do people actually study forest fires? Yes. Oh, why do you do it in Toronto? Well, we can talk about that in another talk, but there's a good reason why I'm in Toronto. But they're shocked to know that, in fact, there's many kinds of people that are interested in fire. So the one that most people are familiar with are fire behavior people, physics, chemistry, fire predicting spread rates, and so on. There's obviously fire ecologists, and here at the University of Alberta, you have some of the best in the world of ecologists that have been focusing on fire and looking at the impact of fire. There's a new area, and fortunately you have some of these at the University of Alberta as well. Tara McGee and her colleagues doing what we call the human dimensions of wildland fire. So we're talking here about social scientists getting involved in fire issues. And down here in the corner is me and my community fire management systems. Basically engineers that focus on the decision making and the planning. When my daughter was small, she said, "What do you do, Daddy?" I said, "I help Smokey Bear do his job, cheaper and better." And then the world changed and fire was not as evil as it used to be. So I said, "Well, I help Smokey Bear figure out what his job is too." And then later, people started learning all about logistics and Amazon. So I said, because nobody knows what industrial engineering is, I said, I apply logistics to forest fire problems. They sort of understood that. But of course, we're always looking for a new hook. And after Moneyball, me and my colleagues sometimes like to think we do analytics. So I apply analytics to forest fires. But I understand that forest fire management isn't the be-all and the end-all. So you take fire management and you shrink it down, and it's just a small part of ecosystem management. So I know what's important in the big picture. It's just that I know where I am and what I'm doing down there in the corner. So, a few minutes about climate change. And as I said, Mike, Flanagan can tell you a lot more than I ever can. We first learned about climate change back in the mid-'80s. Jim Harrington, the Canadian Forest Service, started writing about it. Then Brian Stocks, in the late 80s, and Mike Flanagan in the early 90s. And I mean, I'm working on my engineering. I'm not paying a lot of attention. But there's two questions that come up in my mind, that come up in the public's mind when they see fire in the landscape. To what extent will climate change impact the boreal forest? And to what extent has climate change impacted the boreal forest? So the will is this. I'm going to share an aha moment with you. One day I was, as usual, up late at night working on a talk, getting ready for a conference, and crunching numbers and running models and doing diagrams. And what I was interested in, what's the burn probability? How likely it is little pieces of a forest management unit in northeastern Ontario are going to burn under the current climate, under 2 times CO2 and 3 times CO2. And it's like Brian Stocks is he's not only a good friend, he's a mentor who's been tremendously influential and important in my career. But I know that he was interested in climate change, and I knew that it's important stuff and it was coming down the tubes, but I didn't quite appreciate how quickly or with the significant impact. So I'm crunching the numbers and I say, well, there's burn probabilities for that forest under the current climate. Let's run it under 2 times CO2, and it's like, yeah, well, things are heating up. Like the darker red is a higher burn probability. Yeah, well, not going to lose a lot of sleep over that. That's 2 times CO2. And then I ran 3 times CO2. And I said, whoa. I called my wife and daughter and I said, look at this. This is incredible. I know BJ's been working on this stuff, but it's far more important than I imagined. So that's my aha moment about, yes, climate change will have a significant impact on the boreal forest. The next question is, to what extent has it? So every spring, first large fire, wherever it is in Canada, I get calls, media calls, reporters. Is this fire because of climate change? And the answer, of course, is we don't know. Like, no particular fire is a result of climate change. It's a pattern of fires. It's a fire regime. And it's difficult to actually detect signals of climate change in the forest. But I was very fortunate. One day, a statistician called David Brillinger came to the University of Toronto, and little serendipitous things happen in your life. David he's a Canadian at Berkeley. He contacted people that said, He said, Canadians keep good statistics. They must have good fire statistics. He needed some good fire statistics. So he called somebody, and then he eventually called me, and he said, you must have some good statistics. I said, yeah. He said, can I have some of that data? I said, sure. I said, why are you interested? He says, oh, I want to study fire statistics for Canada. He said, oh, I used to canoe up near Temagami in northeastern Ontario. I said, oh, that's where I was born, near there. He said, wow. He said, we ought to talk. So next time he came to Toronto, he gave a talk, and he went to the statistics department, and I was sitting in the back of the room, just like my students. And at the end of his talk, he said, Dave Martell's in the back corner there. He's got some interesting fire problems. You statisticians ought to go talk to him. And that opened the floodgates and brought me Charmaine Dean and Doug Wolford and John Braun. And we've done a lot of statistical work, and this is an example of it. And the graphs on the right are essentially, I won't lose you in the details, but we published this in 2013. This is one of the first concrete indications of what appears to be an impact of climate change on the boreal forest. And this is a fire regime, the fire season in a portion of Alberta, and the line going down to the right means the day of the year in which the fire season is starting is getting earlier and earlier, and the bottom one is going up, means the day of the year, the final day of the fire season in Alberta is going up. So this is one of the few early indications that climate change appears to be affecting fire regimes in Canada. So I want to switch now to one of the other drivers, and the other driver that I'm interested in is changing land use patterns. So basically, a number of things are going on. Those of you in the forest industry will appreciate particularly there's a decline in the relative importance of timber production in some areas. Species at risk and other conservation measures are gaining prominence, and there's increased use of forest and wildlands for both recreation and residential homes, and I'm sure some of you have residential homes. Here's one. This is a fire I was on in northwestern Ontario, Kenora 23, back in the 1980s. This is not a before and after. This was a lucky unlucky. The cabin on the left was, the owner was lucky, despite the fact that he built his cabin up, nestled in the woods, where the pine boughs would brush on his window, and stored his firewood under his cabin, probably his fuel as well, just to increase the flammability of this little time bomb. And one on the right probably had the same kind of a cabin and wasn't lucky. So when the Alberta fire people come and tell you you ought to FireSmart your community and you ought to FireSmart your cabin, you should listen. This is what happens now. This is sort of a good news, bad news. The bad news is the fire burned right up to the cabin. The good news is the fire people managed to get in there with a sprinkler kit and save the cabin. So some people think that's good. I got my cabin saved. Some people think that's bad. I got a crummy landscape. Well, you know, when somebody's out there fighting a fire, they don't call you up and say, do you want me to save it or not? They just go ahead and save it. Changing public attitudes is another driver. And basically, growing recognition of the importance of ecosystem services and conflict between industrial land use and conservation, growing intolerance of smoke in urban areas, and I'm going to come back to that one. Growing recognition that fire is a natural ecosystem process that needs not always be fully excluded from the forest. So these are changing attitudes. As I said, I started off in the fire control unit. They don't have a fire control unit in Ontario anymore. They have an aviation, forest fires, and emergency services unit, and they do fire management. Some fiscal realities. There's the GDP for Canada. There's the oil price that you people know far better and appreciate better than I. There's the unemployment rate, and there's the Canadian dollar. So what does this mean? First of all, fire management is for the most part a public service in Canada, so governments are going to be hard stretched to pay for it. And companies are going to be concerned about the level of fire protection that they get on their timber resources. So these realities are going to impact the way fire management is delivered in the coming years. Fire management costs money. Here's the cost of fire management in Canada from back to 1970 up to 2009. We're still gathering data. Basically, the blue line is what we call the fixed cost, the pre-suppression, what the organization spends prior to the start of the fire season. The green line is the emergency firefighting, the extra funds that they have to spend when fires escape initial attack. And the red line is the top, is the total of those. So you can see a number of things trending upwards and more variable. So fire managers or managers making decisions have difficulty resolving some of their decisions. Here's some provincial examples, and the one on the bottom left is Alberta. So you can see every once, things are pretty stable and everything blows up, stable, and then things really blow up. And then they go calm down. But you had a bad fire season in Alberta last year. So, people say, what's the fire season going to be this year? And I always say, well, given the long-term forecast, could be pretty bad unless it starts to rain. Like, we do not have the ability to really forecast it. And here's some of the other provinces. So, I've talked about the drivers. I want to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities. So, ecosystem management, that's a challenge, and I think it's an opportunity as well. Addressing the needs of First Nations, that's a challenge, and I'm not sure how many opportunities, but I think there are some out there. And because I'm primarily interested in fire, I'm going to spend most of my time on the development and implementation of new fire management strategies. So, ecosystem management is a new word. This is a Google Ngram. The word forest management started being used back in the 1800s, increased its use. I don't know why it declined, and then it increased again. Ecosystem management started back there, late 70s, not much happening, and then it took off. And down there in the corner, you can't see it, it's so low, is forest ecosystem management. So forest ecosystem management, new concept, new terms, new stuff, new challenges. So one of my ecological people said, oh, you need to learn more about ecosystems. And go read the Bible on ecosystem management in the Boreal forest. So their definition of ecosystem management, I'll let you read it. But basically, this is a book that was edited by Sylvie Gauthier, a renowned forest ecologist. I call her a fire ecologist. And that's their definition of ecosystem management. And there's widespread agreement that ecosystem management should replace and is replacing traditional sustained yield, even age management. But we got a challenge. Forest ecologists study ecosystem processes, and they share their knowledge with forest managers and others. Forest managers use planning models to help determine things like when and where to harvest and regenerate forest stands, when and where to establish, maintain, use, and decommission forest access roads, how to deal with fire and other natural disturbance processes, and a whole lot of other things to produce an appropriate mix of social, economic, and ecological benefits over time. The problem is we have two solitudes. The book on the left is the Bible on ecosystem management in the Boreal forest. The one on the right is the Bible for my area, Use of Operations Research and Analytics for Forest Management Planning. I hope I don't insult anybody, but as far as I went through the authors of the book on the left, and I only saw one person that I recognized as being a forest management planning specialist, as in the kind of mathematical modeling I do. And I know the people in the book on the right, I'm one of them, and there's only one person in there that really knows much about ecology and ecosystems. So these people are doing their stuff, and they're studying and presenting it at different conferences and writing it in different books. So the challenge is that they're in two solitudes. The opportunity is this is a chance for them to get together. This is a time for forest ecologists to get together and meet with their forest management planning people and start to talk and share ideas about how to manage the forest. And if we don't do that, we're not going to ever deliver on the promise of ecosystem management. Another one is addressing the needs of First Nations, and I'm talking from a fire perspective. First Nations communities are directly, so to speak, in the line of fire. Northern Saskatchewan 2015 was a good example. Smoke is often a greater threat than the fire itself. They're both threatened by fire and they benefit from it by fighting it. It's a source of cash. They're also the beneficiaries of natural fire because their culture, their land use depends on having natural ecosystems. And if we exclude fire from the boreal forest, we won't have a natural forest. So quite frankly, they're the ones that have the most at stake in terms of whether we fight fires, how aggressively we fight them. So what are their needs? Ask them, okay? You know, I have very little idea. I got two vignettes. When my father worked for an iron ore mining in Quebec, one day a trapper, an Aboriginal or First Nations trapper came through the property and went to the mine and went in and he said, well, what's this? And, you know, they built the mine in the middle of his trap line and nobody told him, of course. And I've always remembered that little vignette. The other one was 2011, we had a big fire in northwestern Ontario, Sioux Lookout 35. They evacuated the community of Mishkagoguming. And I saw that community after it was evacuated, but more importantly, I saw the message that the chief distributed to her people because they were spread out all over Ontario and they had to send it out in the DVD. And I sat in on the teleconference call every morning when people talked about the issues and the struggle they were having, being evacuated all over different parts of Ontario. So if you want to know who really suffers from fire in this country, it's primarily First Nations people. Yes, I understand Slave Lake. That's definitely a major tragedy. So is Kelowna, so is McClure. But this happens to First Nations people almost every year. They don't burn their communities. That's not the problem. They just get totally disrupted and uprooted. And we've got to figure out how to deal with that. What are some of their needs? As I said, ask them. Some possibilities, probably they want safe, healthy communities. They want to preserve natural ecosystem processes. They want to have traditional use of prescribed fire, and Henry Lewis was a pioneer in documenting that here in Alberta. They want to be involved in research, development, and innovation processes. Unfortunately, FP Innovations took the old ICFME International Crown Fire Management Experiment in the Northwest Territories and has sustained it and has involved the communities, and they're totally involved, and that's a great thing for them. And they also want and should have greater involvement in the delivery of fire management programs. So, what I want to spend most of my time on, and I've lost control of my clock, so I'm not sure how much time I have. I'm thinking I have 15 minutes. Is that right, Jennifer? Okay. So I want to talk about the development and implementation of revised fire management strategies. And I had that originally, it said new fire management strategies. Well, we don't need a new strategy. We don't need to throw out the old and do something new. We need to revise and transition to something different. So, Canadian fire management agencies were established in the early decades of the 20th century. And obviously, I apologize, I know Ontario, I don't know Alberta, but people don't remember. The Porcupine Fire 1911, 73 people killed, 200,000 hectares. Matheson 1960, 273 people. Haileybury 1922, 43. We hear about Australia and say, wow, we're lucky we don't have that. We used to have that. And if we don't properly manage fires, we'll have that again. Alberta, as I said, I have very little knowledge, but I talked to Cordy, and he told me the 1919 Lac La Biche fire and 1936 fires in the Eastern Rockies were sort of important events that led to the creation of the fire organization you have here today. So basically, numbers of fires in area burned in Canada from 1970 to 2014, gradual uptrend in both. So this problem is not going away anytime soon. So Some emerging fire management challenges. So I'm going back to the challenges for the fire management people because, as I said, smoky glasses. Climate change will deliver more fires, more intense and difficult to control fires. More people will build more homes and cottages on more flammable landscapes. Growing recognition and acceptance that fire is a natural ecosystem process, and managers will be expected to put and leave more fire on the landscape. And government fiscal realities will force fire managers to continue to do even more with less. I remember back in the 1980s, John Goodman, the director of the fire program, he went off to a ministry meeting and so what are you doing now, John? He says, we got to do more with less. And then the next year, got to do more with less. They're still doing more with less. So sometime something's going to happen. But Ontario's old fire management policy, and I'm not going back to the one 2 years ago, I'm going back about 10, 15 years. But it was relatively simple. Every forest fire in Ontario receives a response that's governed by the predicted behavior. What's the fire going to do? Potential impact on people, property, and values, estimated cost of the response, and explicit recognition that fire is a natural ecosystem process and it's neither ecologically sound or economically acceptable to try to put them all out. That was the policy, but for the most part, they were still putting most of them out in the intensive protection zone. And I don't blame them, frankly, but it's a step along in a process of gradually moving away from the old fire suppression, fire exclusion, fire control unit to fire management. This is what Ontario was zoned like in those days. 3 zones, intensive, measured, and extensive. The green is the intensive, primarily communities and timber production and other resource industries. So when you had a fire occur there in the intensive zone, you essentially put it out at all reasonable cost. The far north in the red was an area, the extensive zone. You didn't put a fire out unless it was threatening a community. So the orange dots are the First Nations communities. So basically when a fire was going to threaten a First Nations community, you put it out. And there was a transition zone. You sent an initial attack crew out to a fire, but if they couldn't contain it and it wasn't going to do significant damage, you tell them to leave it, just watch it, and treat it like the extensive zone. That's the way things went for a number of years, and life was relatively easy. Because you get a fire, you know what you do. You either watch it, or you hammer it, or you sort of think about whether you're going to hammer it. But life was easy relatively. The decision-making about initial attack was easy. But the emerging fire management challenge is we need revised, affordable management programs that are consistent with ecosystem management objectives, that do not expose people and forest resources to undue risk under climate change. Virtually all fire organizations in Canada have priorities: public safety, property, forest resources, and then other stuff. So public safety is never compromised, and it's not going to be compromised. But we have to develop policies that are more flexible in addressing those needs. So we need to put and leave more fires on the landscape. And I showed one of my former students, I showed him a talk that I gave a number of years ago with that title, and he said, Dave, you had great foresight. You predicted what we're doing now. I said, no, Dennis, I didn't predict that. I'm fortunate that I'm a university professor. I'm surrounded by a lot of bright students. These ideas are in many cases ideas that my students discussed with me, and then I go talk about them. And Jennifer Beverly is one of those, and a lot of the things that I'm saying now, the seeds were the discussions that we had when she was a graduate student. But I'm still an engineer. You know, you have those of you who are foresters have your forestry ring. I have my iron ring as an engineer. So I borrow from the supply chain logistics community to derive a new definition of fire management. So to me, fire management is to deliver the right amount of the right fire to the right place at the right time at the right cost. A simple definition, except it's a little difficult to figure out what right is. So that's a challenge. So what are the implications of this? We have to accelerate the transition from essentially still pretty much fire exclusion policies to fire management policies that will deliver the right amount of the right fire to the right place at the right time at the right cost. So nobody's suggesting that this happen overnight. This has to happen gradually. So we can't nor can we continue to exclude fire, but strategies have to be, these are sort of easy predictions. Fire management strategies need to be revised to achieve a more appropriate balance between the social, economic, and ecological impacts. And fire managers are going to be called upon to resolve increasingly complex, risk-laden decision-making. We hear the term risk management thrown around out there. You want to talk to a risk management, go talk to your local fire manager. He or she's got risk management far more than many of you do. So, coming soon to a forest near you. That's our future. So, if we're going to do this, we have to talk about, we're going to have more focus on prevention and mitigation, more flexibility in organizations to achieve greater efficiency. We got to move from zone-based response where everything is clear, what you're supposed to do, to an appropriate response. See a fire, decide whether you're going to put it out. And that calls for ability to assess the potential impact and respond accordingly on every fire. We're going to have more emphasis on managing risk to balance needs, objectives, and costs, and no specific targets for allowable area burned. This is not what's coming. This is what arrived in Ontario last year, 2014. This was what was implemented in Ontario April 1st, 2015. That's not the future, that's today. I took those texts out of one of their internal training documents. I'm not predicting anything here, I'm telling you what they're doing now. Some examples, as I said, they're not going whole bore. You know, it was a pretty easy fire season in Ontario, fortunately. Fired Thunder Bay 25, May 25th, storm damage island burning, southwest of Armstrong. They basically watched it burn, you know. 2 fires, Thunder Bay 50, Northern Lights Lake, escape. Minimal chance of the fire escaping, it's the one on the bottom left. And Nipigon 38, limited suppression required to prevent spread to communities in that fire. So those are 3 fires, and I asked them, how many fires did you treat differently? Because we're now talking about fires in the old intensive protection zone where they would have fought them before, and I think the tally was about 8, and nothing bad happened. So how can and should we move forward? Well, we have to FireSmart our forests and communities, and saying that here is like bringing coals to Newcastle. I mean, this is the home of FireSmart in Canada, so you people know all about that, and you're doing it exceptionally well. We have to have increased use to prescribed fire. We don't have enough, anywhere near enough in this country. I often ridicule my friends in fire. I say, they have more prescribed fire in High Park 4 blocks from my house than you have in Northern Ontario. But there are issues. What we should be doing, though, is growing wildfires. When you got 350, 500 people and 15 helicopters out there on the landscape dealing with an escaped fire, you ought to sit down and look at it and say, yeah, we want to make sure that this fire doesn't impact this community or these timber supplies, but there's a natural ecosystem over there. Why don't we get a helicopter with a torch and go burn it off? And that's pretty cheap prescribed burning. And I was in the back of a helicopter one day on Sioux Lookout 35, and I watched them burn 25,000 hectares in 2 days with basically 3 guys and 2 helicopters and an air tanker to hit some of the spots that went over the river. Pretty effective ecosystem management. We have to focus on prevention, daily resource deployment. We got to make sure we've got a good detection system, good initial attack dispatching, good large fire management. Everything's got to be done better because we're living closer to the edge. We're going to be living closer to the edge. Improved interagency resource sharing provinces for the last 25 years or so have got a really good system of sharing resources between provinces. Those that can share them, give them up. Those that need them, borrow them. You know, that's a very good, a very effective system, but it still can work even better. So I'm going to quickly, if I got enough time, talk about 3 of those areas in which I've been doing and my students have been working on research. And I'm going to talk about FireSmart. And this again, the concept of FireSmart forest management was developed here in Alberta. I learned about it from Kelvin Hirsch. And basically the idea is you put your roads and your cutovers to fragment the landscape, reduce its flammability. I said, well, that's kind of a cool idea. How are you going to do that? Well, we're just going to look at a map. Well, I'm an engineer. It's like, no, this is a really complicated planning problem. So I got together with a couple of students from Chile and a professor from Chile. And fortunately, I convinced Vic Adamowicz we should use this money to do some international collaboration. Brought these 2 students up to Toronto, and we sent them up to Whitecourt in February. And that was a bit of a learning experience. And then they came back and they built a model, and it's a really neat implementation. So basically what happens is, here's your landscape, you have a fire here and it's going to spread from A to B. If you can go cut that stand, then you can reduce the chance that B will be burned. So you want to ask questions like, what is the risk that stand A imposes on risk B, and can I reduce it by strategically locating my harvest? And the answer is yes. And what you should be doing is deciding, when I harvest block K, how much wood does it produce and how much does it cool a landscape? And we calculate something called the fire protection value, and we did that also on one of Miller Western units. And the dark area is areas that have high fire protection value. You should be harvesting those not just for the wood, but because they cool a landscape. So we think this is kind of neat because it helps us implement the kind of ideas that Kelvin was talking about. Daily air tanker deployment. A number of years ago, Al Tithicott, who was then the head of the fire science program in Ontario, he's now the director, we were trying to work on models of air tanker deployment. How many air tankers do you put at each base? And basically we built models and we had bases that didn't interact. This base, they fought fires around here. This base, they fought fires around there. We set that up in the field and they ran it all summer. We went up there at the end of the fire season and said, okay guys, what do you think of our model? They're pretty polite. They said, interesting model, Dave, but your model doesn't take into account the fact that air attack bases interact. They do. Call us when you solve the real problem. 10 years later, I got a grad student, Kazi Islam, and we went ahead and did that. And now we can go and do things like, depending on the predicted fire load, what is the optimal initial attack radius to use around a base? And essentially what it says is, the more the fire load increases, the shorter the initial attack radius should be. We took that out to the fire people and said, what's going on? We must have a problem with our model here. They said, no, Dave, that's what you do. Like when you got too many fires, you stay close to home. They didn't say, you idiot. But that was good for us because that was validation of our model. A couple of years ago, up pops an email message from Al Tithicott. He said, I thought you might be interested in what our air tankers have been doing in Sudbury or in Timmins today. I looked at that and I said, wow. And I called him up. I said, what is this? He said, well, our air tankers have GPS. We know where they are every 30 seconds. We can draw maps of where they are all year. We can tell what fires are fighting where. And I thought, we can use this data to develop much better, more accurate models of air tanker operations than we ever were able to do in the past. It's like putting a GPS transponder in an aircraft versus hiring a summer student with a clipboard and a $2,000 an hour helicopter to go out there and collect data. So this is incredible, and that's what we've been doing. And this is an example of how we can actually track what the aircraft are doing now. We have to develop some software to analyze the GPS data. And I'm going to close in a minute, but I'm going to say, once I realized that, I said, what about your detection aircraft? Do they have GPS units? It said, yeah. Do you want some data? And the answer is, yeah, we got it. And basically every day detection people have to decide when and where to fly detection routes. But one of the key items of information they don't know is what is the probability that an aircraft will find a fire depending on the fuel, the weather, and the distance to the fire. We could never, I don't have time to go into the detail to tell you why we could never estimate that in the past. But with the GPS data and the fire data, we're able to do that. So now we can do planning of detection routes with a real detection probability, and I can partner with my colleagues that do vehicle routing, the same people that figure out how the purelator should run around the city. We can take the same kind of technology and figure out what's the cheapest way to get detection aircraft to fly around your region to look at the areas that you want to look at. So basically, where you want to send your aircraft depends on people-caused fire occurrence, lightning-caused fire occurrence, spread rate potential, values at risk, primary, secondary, tertiary, detection system performance. The idea is send the detection aircraft to find the potentially destructive fires that the public won't report for free. So we're going to start building models to do that. And there's an example of the detection or the prediction model working in Sioux Lookout District. I want to leave you with 3 closing messages. I predicted and I've told you about what's happening in Ontario now. Fire managers are going to be living in interesting times, more interesting times than they've been in the past. And they will embrace that. They will do it and they will do it well. But we have to work with them to enhance their capacity to do it well. So when we're living in this, you don't just dial up and say we want a new fire management program. You got to figure about what are you going to do for the fire managers so that they can do that and do that well. We have to strengthen the fire research community. When I started in this business, every faculty of forestry had at least 1 fire specialist, and the University of New Brunswick had 3. We don't have anywhere near that capacity in the university system. We don't have that capacity in the Canadian Forest Service, so we got to do something about that. And then final, to sort of wrap it up, Steve Pine, who's an eminent historian, called us out a couple of years ago. He said, where's Canada? Canada used to be recognized as an international leader in fire, and now it's the United States and Australia. We have to do things to restore our fire management community to the leadership position that it had in the past, and it deserves to be in the future, and it needs to be if we expect them to deliver the kind of fire management programs we are asking them to deliver. There's a whole lot of acknowledgements. I'm not going to read them off. Research granting organizations, former students, fire managers, incident commanders that let me hide out on their incident management teams, and so on. And that's my favorite camping site. And I hope I haven't messed up the timing too bad. Thank you very much. I set up this smartphone and it times out after 15 minutes and I've lost my time. Sorry.
I'd like to extend my thanks to Dr. Martell for a very interesting and insightful talk. We do have time for questions, and there's a couple of microphones, and we've got some volunteers who will bring them over to you. If you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand.
Go easy, eh? They took the mic there, sorry.
Hey, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the fixed detection programs we have here in Alberta.
I haven't spent a lot of time in Alberta, but one time I did spend some time here. I got a chance to go out and see it, and it looked pretty good to me. Peter Courts studied the aerial detection versus fixed detection many years ago, and essentially there's some forests for which towers are are the best solution, and some where patrol aircraft are the best solution. So it basically depends. And I have a whole long lecture that takes about an hour and a half to describe the factors when you should be going towards towers and when you should be going to aircraft. And in general, the rule of thumb that Peter Kurtz developed was in your higher value areas, that is high forest resource values or communities, you probably want to have towers, where in the other areas you want to use aircraft. That being said, I have never studied the detection system in Alberta. So. But there are ways of analyzing that problem. That's a very, I should have said, that's a very good question. It's a very, very costly question.
Well, Dr. Martell, thank you very much for your presentation. It sort of brought back memories of my days in Kirkland Lake and Swastika Nursery way back when. And you know, you started off your presentation about talking about the challenges in the boreal forests and that may relate to fire. And you did happen to mention mountain pine beetle, and I was glad to hear that. But my question to you is, what would you likely do, or what kind of approach would you have for fire management when the mountain pine beetle comes to a theater near you? And here again at the University of Alberta, there's very solid evidence that mountain pine beetle is already crossed into jack pine. And the concern is that jack pine now is a national problem, and I would suspect that with the jack pine resource in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, that maybe in the near future, I mean, nothing is for sure. How would that issue interject into your fire management program?
So let me answer that in a very narrow way. I'm an engineer. I know very little about biology and very little about forest biology and about entomology. But I spent a bit of time with an incident management team on a fire budworm killed, or a mountain pine beetle killed stands in the BC interior. And what would I say? Basically, when you get a fire there, do your best to handle it safely. Try to contain it at the barriers you can safely. Try to grow it, because if it doesn't burn today, it's going to burn tomorrow. If you think you can get a torch out there and burn some of it safely, do it. And hope that nature fragments the landscape with big burns in such a way that it ultimately cools the landscape and doesn't cause a lot of damage to people and property and so on. But I'm looking at after the fact. I think what you're really saying is, what do you do when the infestation is starting to grow? And the answer is, I'm not sure. I don't know whether prescribed burning is going to help you much, because to the extent that I understand mountain pine beetle populations, you know, you could spend a lot of time sort of burning out areas, and a big windstorm comes along and blows a population over that. So I really don't have any answers. Like, these fires are phenomenal fires in the BC interior. So I guess my answer is, go out and deal with them as safely as you possibly can, because they're going to be there. I mean, that stuff is it's going to burn eventually. So if you have an opportunity to grow a fire safely because you've got the resources there, do it, because if you don't burn it this year, nature will burn it sometime in the next few years. So I guess my answer is, that's a good question that somebody ought to spend some time thinking about, that I don't really have answers for. And that's probably a good example of, we need some good entomologists to work with some good fire managers and some good fire management planners to come up with some site-specific solutions for that kind of thing. Bring the two books together.
Hi, Dave.
Can't see you.
I'm over here on your left.
Ah,
Thanks. That was really good.
is that Dave Schroeder?
It is.
Hi,
yes.
Dave. The lighting's
So-
not good here.
So I'm involved with fire prevention and FireSmart, and we spend a lot of money on it, as you've indicated. And
And I said it was good.
so I'm interested.
I said this is where it started. But anyways, go ahead.
I'm interested from your perspective as an engineer and some of the work you've done at what are your thoughts on how you determine those, whether that's a good investment or what is the strength of that investment. So I've got a personal interest in that. My PA is coming up in March, and we're kind of wanting to, that's one of the questions that's on the list, but I think we hear about that a lot in the States now, where they are spending so much money on firefighting, and they're also spending a lot of money on prevention, and there's a lot of people insisting that the prevention is going to save the money in the long term, but that's, that could be 20 years or 15 years before you see that return. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on that return on investment part.
So I can't go back and judge past investments, and I don't know anybody in the world that can give me an economic evaluation of prevention efforts. We do it because we think it's important to do it. We think it's effective. But to go back to your question about fuel treatment, I would be interested in the question, what are you going to do for the next 5 years? And I think that I do have an idea how you would approach that. There's two important questions that have to be answered. What is the relative effectiveness of different fuel treatments on the ignition and spread of fires? And I don't think we understand that well enough to understand the impact of fire ignition and spread on managed fuels. And that's not something I would do. That's something that a guy like Mike Watton and his people can do. But that's an important question to spend more time and money on, to figure out what is the impact of ignition, if I treat this piece of landscape with this type of a fuel treatment activity, part of the FireSmart program, how does it affect the ignition probability and the spread of fires that occur? What I am interested in is to go back to the stuff that I talked about with no electric. Once you do that, then people like me can help you decide how to best allocate a quick budget to get the biggest bang for your buck. So just like we could figure out the fire protection value of the different stands on Miller Western's land, we can go in and essentially build, pardon the jargon, big stochastic integer programming models to help you prioritize and say, if you got so many millions of dollars, then those are the stands you should be treating. So I think that's an important, given the importance of FireSmart and fuel management, and given what's coming our way, I think that we should start getting more people working in that area. And I don't know that I have enough time to do it, but I got friends who would be really interested in working on that problem.
I just got a question in regards to your model that you showed with the increase of the CO2 ratio.
Sorry, I'm missing the last of your sentence.
I'm just got a question in regards to the model you showed about the increased CO2 ratio in the air and the fire intensity. I just wanted to know what other factors other than just increased temperature went into that model.
Basically, I went to Mike Watton and Mike Flanagan.
If you want to go to the microphone, maybe this
sorry.
podium, unless you want to check your remote just if you turned it off, perhaps?
I don't know, did I turn it off? Okay, it's not working. So basically, there's a whole sort of methodology that fire and climate people, so you could talk to Mike Flanagan. So basically, they take the CO2 projections over the air over time, like 2 times and 3 times CO2, and then we look at the existing fuel type, and we look at predicting essentially the same fire occurrence regimes, and we look at the intensities of the fires and the spread rates that are going to happen. So it's kind of like a forecast of what's going to happen if these fires, and the model that I'm showing, we're not fighting those fires. But we're not fighting those fires in all three cases. So we're comparing apples to apples, but we're not comparing oranges. So that's essentially what goes into it.
Hi, I have a question. I was wondering what are the future research that you're looking into? As you know, big data, those kind of things are becoming more prevalent. I was wondering.
Sorry, I'm not understanding you properly.
What areas in the future are going to lead kind of your research, especially with optimization? Are you going to look into new models, new ideas?
Okay, so what I'm focusing on right now is the detection planning stuff, the aerial detection patrol routing. We've been working on that. We've got a lot more work to do. So we're working in Ontario on that. I won't go into a long story, but when I was in a fire up in Mackenzie 2 years ago, the Air Ops branch director, I caught him in a weak moment. We were down on the helipad, and he was busy mining the helipad, so I picked his brain for a couple hours, and I ran a bunch of potential fire research projects by him, and I finally convinced him to adopt one. So when I get time, and I'm going to go out there to Dryden, and we're going to try the daily deployment stuff. And I have some other stuff that's sort of airy-fairy landscape management, risk management that is very interesting from an intellectual standpoint, but it's not terribly pragmatic. But those are sort of the three things I'm going to focus on for the next few years, plus something called the large fire management problem. Basically, if you have a large fire, put water on it. If you have a large fire, and you have a schedule of when you can get resources and what those resources are going to cost, and the ops chief has an idea about where he wants to contain it, then I can build a model that'll help minimize the cost of doing that. So that's where I'm sort of headed, I think.
Hi there. I just have a question. I'm not sure if you'll, if this is your area of expertise, but your
Probably
model
isn't, but anyways.
Your model with the climate change and the more intensive fires. Speaking from a forestry background, where most climate change models show the biological ecological zones moving further up into the boreal forest, do you know of any studies that sort of maybe correlate the possibility of intense fires making room for that biological species movement as the climate increases up there?
You're right, way beyond my level of expertise. My first point of contact would be Mike Flanagan, but I'll bet you he's got friends that he could refer you to, for sure. It's a good question, but way beyond my level of expertise. Better get me out of here soon before I trash the stage. I know I shouldn't stand near this, but anyways. We done? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for everyone coming here. Let's give another round of applause for our sponsor as well as for David's wonderful talk here. Also, two people that Brittany and Simon have for with microphones. Thank you.